She's escaping from hell, finally becoming free. And then she makes the most unbelievable decision of her life. She turns around and walks straight back into danger. Not once, not twice, but again and again. Her name was Harriet Tubman, the woman who escaped slavery, then went back.
The Story Vault. Unlock the untold.
Harriet Tubman was born around 1822 on Maryland's eastern shore. I say around because no one knows the exact date. That's one of the cruelest things about slavery. Even your birthday wasn't considered important enough to record. Her birth name was Araminta Ross. Her family called her Minty. Years later, she would take her mother's first name, Harriet, and the world would remember her by that name forever. From the moment she was born, her life belonged to someone else. She wasn't allowed to decide where she lived, what work she did, or whether she would ever see her family again. Enslaved families were often separated. Children could be sold away. Parents could disappear overnight. Imagine growing up knowing that the people you love could simply be taken away because someone else signed a piece of paper. That wasn't Harriet's greatest fear. It was everyday life. As a little girl, she was rented out to different households to work. The jobs were exhausting. Sometimes she cared for babies. Sometimes she trapped muskrats in freezing water. Sometimes she hauled heavy loads that would have challenged grown adults. And if she failed, punishment came quickly. Years later, she still carried the scars. Then, when she was still a teenager, something happened that changed her life forever. One day, Harriet was standing inside a country store. An enslaved man nearby had tried to escape. An overseer chased after him and demanded Harriet help stop him. She refused. The man ran past her. The overseer grabbed a heavy metal weight and threw it. He missed the man he was aiming for. Instead, it struck Harriet in the head. The blow nearly killed her. For days, people weren't sure she would survive. She did survive, but she was never the same. For the rest of her life, she experienced sudden sleep attacks, severe headaches, and vivid dreams. Today, many doctors believe those symptoms were the result of a traumatic brain injury. Harriet herself understood them differently. She believed those dreams were messages from God. Whether you see them as a medical condition or as spiritual visions, one thing is certain. They became part of the courage that defined her life. Again and again, she said she trusted God to guide her through impossible situations. And somehow, she kept surviving them. As Harriet grew older, the fear that haunted every enslaved family came closer to home. She watched brothers, sisters, friends disappear after being sold to distant plantations. Each sale meant another family torn apart, another goodbye with no promise of ever meeting again. She realized something terrifying. If she stayed, the same thing could happen to her. She might wake up one morning, and by sunset, everything she had ever known would be gone. Around 1849, that fear became reality. Her owner died, and rumors began spreading that enslaved people from the estate would soon be sold. For Harriet, that wasn't just bad news. It was a deadline. If she waited, she might lose the chance forever. So one night, she made the biggest decision of her life. She would escape. Not with an army, not with weapons. Just one woman walking into the darkness. Imagine that first step. No flashlight, no map, no phone, no one to call. Just forests, swamps, strangers, and people hunting for runaways. The journey north was hundreds of miles. She traveled mostly at night. She hid during the day. She followed rivers. She looked for people who might secretly help. And every sound in the woods could have meant someone was coming to capture her. There were rewards for catching escaped slaves. The posters described people like Harriet not as human beings, but as property. Days later, she crossed into Pennsylvania. For the first time in her life, she stood on free soil. She tried to describe that moment. She said it felt as though she had crossed into heaven. She looked at her hands to make sure she was still the same person. The sun looked brighter. The air felt different. Everything seemed new. After spending her entire life as someone else's property, she was finally free. Most people would stop there. And honestly, who could blame them? She had escaped. She had survived. She had earned the life she dreamed about. No one would have expected anything more. But as Harriet looked around, one thought refused to leave her. She was free. Her family wasn't. Her friends weren't. Thousands of people she had grown up with were still trapped in the life she had just escaped. And she couldn't convince herself that freedom meant much if she was the only one who got to enjoy it. She had only been free for a short time when she heard heartbreaking news. Some of her relatives were about to be sold. If that happened, they could disappear forever. One family member might be sent to Georgia, another to Louisiana, another somewhere else entirely. Once they were separated, finding them again would be almost impossible. Harriet couldn't let that happen. So she packed almost nothing, said goodbye to the safety she had finally found, and started walking south, back toward the place she'd risked everything to escape. Think about how dangerous that was. The first time Harriet escaped, she was just one person trying to evade being seen. Now, she was planning to leave with other people. Children, parents, brothers, sisters. The more people you travel with, the harder it is to stay hidden. One crying baby, one wrong turn, one person losing their nerve could get everyone caught. Harriet knew she couldn't do it alone. That's where something called the Underground Railroad came in. Despite the name, it wasn't underground, and it wasn't a railroad. It was a secret network of ordinary people, free black families, church leaders, farmers, Quakers, and others who believed slavery was wrong. They offered food, a place to sleep, directions, sometimes just enough help to get someone to the next safe house. Each person usually knew only a small part of the route. That way, if someone was caught, they couldn't expose the entire network. It worked almost like a chain of whispers. Quiet, careful, invisible. Harriet became one of the network's most trusted conductors. That's what they called the people who guided others to freedom. She traveled mostly at night. She learned which roads to avoid, which houses were safe, which rivers could hide footprints. She even used the North Star to help guide the way. Every journey required planning, patience, and an incredible amount of courage. As Harriet's rescues became more successful, slaveholders began to notice people were disappearing. Not one or two, entire families. Rewards were offered for information leading to her capture. Stories about those rewards have grown over time, and many of the biggest numbers repeated today can't be verified. But one thing is certain. The people hunting Harriet wanted her stopped. To them, she wasn't simply an escaped slave anymore. She was helping others escape too, and every successful rescue challenged the system they depended on.
What amazes me most is that Harriet didn't look like the kind of person you'd expect to become a legend. She was only about 5 feet tall. She couldn't read or write. She had no military training, no wealth, no political power, no famous family name. Everything she accomplished with determination, careful planning, and an extraordinary ability to stay calm under pressure. Sometimes, that's more powerful than anything else.
Harriet also understood something important about fear. Everyone she guided was terrified. And honestly, who wouldn't be? If they were caught, they could be whipped, sold away from their children, or worse. Some people became so frightened during the journey, they wanted to turn back. Imagine getting halfway to freedom and deciding the risk was too great. Harriet knew that if even one person returned, they could reveal the route and endanger everyone else. So she insisted that the group keep moving. It was a heartbreaking reality of these missions. Once the journey had begun, turning back could put every life in the group at risk. That's how serious the stakes were. Over the years, Harriet kept returning, again and again. Historians generally agree she made around 13 rescue missions and helped lead about 70 people directly to freedom, while also providing guidance that assisted many more. Those numbers may not sound enormous at first, but think about what each trip required. Hundreds of miles on foot, moving through hostile territory, avoiding armed patrols, keeping entire groups alive. Then, doing it all over again. It's not just impressive, it's almost unbelievable. People began calling her Moses, just like the biblical figure who led his people out of slavery. Harriet didn't give herself that name. Others did. Because to the people she rescued, that's exactly who she was. A guide, a protector, a path to freedom. Most people would have been satisfied after saving dozens of lives. But Harriet Tubman was never looking for a comfortable ending, because by the time America entered the Civil War, she understood something. Freedom for individuals would never be enough. The entire system had to change. In 1861, the United States entered its bloodiest conflict, the Civil War. A war that began over whether the Southern states could leave the Union, but quickly became inseparable from the question of slavery. For Harriet, this was the moment she had been preparing for her entire life. She knew the land. She knew how enslaved people thought. She knew the routes. She knew the dangers. And most importantly, people trusted her. When the Union Army moved into areas where enslaved people lived, thousands escaped toward Union lines. They were called contraband by the military. The word itself is complicated. It came from the idea that enslaved people who escaped to Union forces were considered property seized from the Confederacy. But behind that legal language were real human beings, people who had spent their entire lives waiting for a chance to be free. Harriet began working with the Union Army. At first, she helped provide information and support for newly freed people. She worked as a nurse, a cook, a scout. and eventually, a spy. And this is the part of Harriet Tubman's story that sounds almost impossible. The woman who once had to hide from armed men was now secretly gathering intelligence behind enemy lines. Think about the irony. Years earlier, she had been running from the people who wanted to capture her. Now, she was walking into dangerous territory because soldiers needed her knowledge. She understood something most Union officers didn't: the geography, the communities, the people. She knew where Confederate forces were moving. She knew where enslaved communities were located. And she knew who could be trusted. One of her most remarkable contributions came in 1863 during the Combahee River Raid in South Carolina. Harriet worked alongside Union officers to gather intelligence and help plan the operation. Union gunboats traveled through Confederate territory along the Combahee River. The mission destroyed Confederate supplies and helped free hundreds of enslaved people. According to historical accounts, Harriet helped guide the mission by providing crucial information about the area and the people living there. Imagine that scene. A woman who was once considered property, standing aboard a military vessel, helping lead a military operation. A woman who had once been denied the right to make decisions about her own life was now helping make decisions that changed the lives of hundreds of others. History has a strange way of reversing the roles. After the Civil War ended, Harriet Tubman could have finally stopped. She had spent decades fighting. She had escaped slavery, risked her life rescuing others, helped the Union Army, survived dangers that would have broken most people. At that point, most people would have said, "You have done enough." But Harriet Tubman didn't see the world that way. Because to her, freedom was not just about removing chains. It was about giving people the chance to build a better life afterward. After emancipation, millions of formerly enslaved people suddenly faced a new reality. They were legally free, but freedom came with enormous challenges. Many had no land, no money, no education, no protection. They had escaped one system, but they were entering a world where inequality still shaped almost every part of life. Harriet understood this better than almost anyone because she had lived it. She spent the rest of her life helping others. She supported formerly enslaved families. She cared for people who had nowhere else to go. She worked with organizations helping those who had been abandoned after the war. And later, she became involved in another major fight for equality: the fight for women's right to vote. This part of her story is especially interesting because Harriet Tubman was connected to two of America's biggest movements for freedom: the abolition of slavery and women's suffrage. She worked alongside famous activists of her time, speaking at meetings and sharing her experiences. Her message was simple. A society couldn't truly call itself free while denying entire groups of people the ability to shape their own future. But despite everything she had done, Harriet's later years were not easy. The country celebrated her story, but often failed to support her in practical ways. She lived modestly. She struggled financially. The woman who had risked everything for others often had to fight for basic recognition herself. There's something almost painful about that. History loves heroes, but sometimes forgets to take care of them. People remember the dramatic moments, the escapes, the rescues, the victories, but they don't always see what happens afterward. The years of struggle, the quiet sacrifices, the everyday reality of someone who spent their life serving others.
In her later years, Harriet finally had a home of her own in Auburn, New York. The land had been purchased with help from supporters. There, she continued caring for others. Her house became a place where people could find support. Even in old age, she was still doing the same thing she had always done, creating a path for someone else.
Harriet Tubman died on March 10th, 1913. She was around 90 years old. At her funeral, she was remembered as a remarkable woman. But perhaps the most powerful thing about her legacy is not the number of people she helped. It's the impossible choice she made after gaining her own freedom. Today, Harriet Tubman is remembered as one of the greatest figures in American history. Her image appears on monuments. Her story is taught around the world. Her name represents courage, resistance, and the belief that ordinary people can change history. But perhaps the most fascinating thing about Harriet Tubman is that she never saw herself as extraordinary. She was simply someone who knew what it felt like to need help and decided that when she had the chance, she would become that help for someone else.
The Story Vault. Unlock the untold.